Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. For 35 years, I have kept the keys to the Praise House on Saint Helena Island, and for 20 of those years, I have carried a secret I never told my own wife. On watch night, with the whole community gathered inside, my daughter stood up in front of everyone and said, "Daddy, it's time we talked about the future of this land." Outside the gate, a bulldozer sat idling, engine running, headlights cutting through the dark. I did not raise my voice. I looked at that machine
and I picked up the phone.
What none of them knew was what I had been protecting all along and why. That story starts 10 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that looked like every other Tuesday morning of my life, right up until it didn't. I was on my knees on the roof of Praise House, running my palm along a seam where the shingles had lifted in the last storm. The wood underneath had gone soft to the touch. I made a note in my head to order new flashing before the spring rains came, the same note I had made 3 winters running, and I told myself the way I always did that this would be the year I finally got to it. The key to the front door sat in my shirt pocket, same as always, a small, hard weight against my chest. I had carried that key so long, I no longer noticed its shape unless I went looking for it with my thumb, which I did now out of habit before climbing back down the ladder. My phone rang while I was still 3 rungs from the ground. I figured it was Deacon Ashby calling about the candle order for watch night, or maybe the county about the drainage permit I had been chasing since October. I answered without looking at the screen the way a man answers a phone when he has no reason yet to be afraid of it.
It was not Deacon Ashby.
It was Loretta Sumter from 2 houses down from mine, and her voice was doing something I had never heard it do in 11 years of knowing her. "Mr. Cornelius," she said, "you need to come home right now. Something is wrong with Odessa." I do not remember climbing down the rest of that ladder. I remember standing at the bottom of it with my hand still closed around a rung that was not there anymore, and I remember the sound the truck door made when I slammed it, louder than I meant it, the whole cab shaking with it. The drive from Praise House to Clement Road takes 11 minutes on an ordinary day. I do not know how long it took me that Tuesday. I know I ran the stop sign at Seaside and Martin without slowing, and I know a woman in a blue sedan laid on her horn, and I know I did not look at her because looking at her would have cost me half a second I did not have. Odessa was on the kitchen floor when I got there, with Loretta kneeling beside her, holding her hand, and the whole left side of my wife's face had gone soft in a way that no face is supposed to go soft, like something underneath it had simply stopped holding its shape. She was trying to say my name. What came out was not my name. It was close to my name, the way a photograph left too long in the sun is close to the person in it. The ambulance took 19 minutes to reach us, though it felt considerably longer than that. And every one of those minutes I held her hand and told her the same 3 things over and over, because they were the only 3 things I could think to say. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Hold on, Odessa. Hold on. At the hospital, they moved fast, in a way that told me more than any doctor's face could have told me. They took her through double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and left me standing in a hallway holding a clipboard I did not remember being handed, my hand shaking hard enough that the pen kept sliding out of the little clip meant to hold it steady. I do not know how long I stood in that hallway. Long enough that the fluorescent light overhead started to hum in a way I could feel behind my eyes. Long enough that a nurse walked past me twice, and the second time slowed down like she was deciding whether I needed a chair more than I needed to be left alone. A doctor came through those doors a little after 10 in the morning. Her name tag said Dr. Renwick, and her face had the particular stillness of a woman about to say something she had said many times before and had never once gotten used to saying. "Mr. Odom," she said, "your wife has had a stroke. We are running further tests now to understand the extent of it, but I want you to know she is stable and she is fighting." The hallway smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Somewhere down the corridor, a cartwheel squeaked once, then went quiet. The fluorescent light kept its same flat hum. A clock on the wall read 10:17, and I watched the second hand complete one full circle before I moved at all. I nodded, though nothing about what she had said had made its way past my ears yet. Somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been holding steady since the kitchen floor, let go all at once. And instead of the tears I expected, instead of anything I recognized as grief, a short, strange laugh came out of me, right there in that hallway, sharp and sudden, gone almost before I heard it leave my own mouth. Dr. Renwick did not flinch. She had likely seen stranger things come out of frightened men. But my own face went hot with something close to shame, because in 35 years of keeping that praise house standing through every storm the Low Country ever threw at it, I had never once heard myself make a sound like that, and I did not know, standing in that hallway, with my wife's life hanging somewhere behind a set of double doors, what kind of man I had just become. I found a corner of that hallway with a window in it, and I stood there until my hands had stopped enough to hold the phone steady. I looked at her name on the screen for a while before I pressed it, the way a man looks at a door he already knows is going to be heavy before he puts his hand on it. Then I called my daughter. It rang 4 times before she picked up, and when she did, there was traffic behind her voice, and the particular clipped tone she uses when she is walking somewhere important and does not want to slow down for it. "Daddy, I'm heading into a closing in 10 minutes. Can this wait?" "Your mother had a stroke," I said. I kept my voice level, the way I keep it level when a board on the roof gives more than it should, and I do not want anyone below me to hear the alarm in it. "She's at St. Catherine's now. They're running tests." There was a pause on the line, not long, just long enough for me to hear a car door somewhere behind her, and a man's voice asking if she was coming. "Okay," she said. "Keep me posted. I really do have to get in there, but keep me posted."
The line went quiet before I could say anything else.
I stood with the phone still against my ear for a second or two after the call had already ended, and in the dark glass of the window, I caught my own reflection standing there like that, holding a phone to an ear, with nothing left on the other end of it. I did not call her back. I put the phone in my pocket next to the key, and I went to sit with my wife. 2 days later, they moved Odessa to a room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked out over the parking lot, and by then she could speak in short, careful sentences, the left side of her mouth still slow to catch up with the right. I sat in the chair beside her bed most of that afternoon, watching her work through a cup of orange juice with a bendable straw, like it was the most important task either of us had ever attempted.
She did not call back.
"Yet did she?" Odessa said, not looking at me, her eyes on the parking lot instead. I did not answer right away, and that was answer enough. Odessa set the cup down on the tray with a small, deliberate click. "Cornelius," she said, "sit down all the way. I have something I should have told you a long time ago, and I am tired of it living in me instead of out here where it belongs." I sat down all the way. "Do you remember?" "Her 16th birthday," she said, "when her friends from the private school came out to the island for the afternoon, the ones whose daddies worked in Charleston in tall buildings." She had been quiet about that afternoon for so many years I had almost forgotten it happened at all, filed it away with 100 other ordinary Saturdays. I remembered. I had been at Praise House that day, sweeping the front steps before the party because the deacons wanted it clean for a wedding the following morning. I remember the light coming off the marsh that afternoon, the kind that turns everything gold for about 20 minutes before it goes soft and gray again. I remember seeing a cluster of teenagers gathered by a car at the edge of the lot and thinking, without much thought behind it at all, that they were somebody's grandchildren come out to visit for the weekend. I went back to my sweeping. I did not think of it again until just now, 22 years late, sitting in a hospital chair with my wife's hand growing warm on top of mine. "She saw you through the fellowship hall window," Odessa said, "sweeping, and she asked her friends to wait by the car while she ran and told you the party had already started without her, and could you please not come by until after they'd gone." The hallway outside Odessa's door had gone quiet, in the particular way hospital hallways go quiet in the late afternoon, a cart somewhere far off, a television murmuring behind another door, nothing close, nothing loud. "I did not know that," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "I know you didn't," Odessa said. "I never told you. I told myself I was protecting you from it. But Cornelius, I have been carrying that afternoon for 22 years, and I am tired of carrying it alone. I did not ask her anything else. I did not ask what my daughter had said to her friends about who I was, or whether she had used the word janitor or caretaker or something worse, or nothing at all, just a shrug and a change of subject. I did not ask because some part of me already knew the shape of the answer and had known it for a long time, without ever once letting myself look at it directly. My hand found the key in my pocket without my telling it to, and I closed my fingers around it until the metal teeth pressed a line into my palm I would still be able to feel an hour later. Odessa reached over and put her good hand on top of my closed fist, and neither one of us said another word for a long while. And out past the window, the parking lot lights came on, one by one, against a sky going the color of a bruise just starting to heal. 3 weeks after they let Odessa come home, the doorbell rang on a Thursday evening while I was drying the last of the supper dishes. Through the front window, I could see Desmond standing on the porch with a bunch of yellow tulips wrapped in cellophane and a slim leather portfolio tucked under his arm, and behind him, past the porch rail, the marsh grass had gone the deep green it goes in early summer, the tide just starting to come back in over the mudflats. "Walter," he said when I opened the door, then caught himself and laughed. "Forgive me, Cornelius. I should have that memorized by now, shouldn't I?" He had never once called me by the wrong name before, and I noted it the way I note a loose board underfoot, quietly, without saying anything about it yet. "Come on in," I told him. He crossed the living room straight to where Odessa sat in her reading chair, bent down and pressed a careful kiss to her cheek. "You look wonderful," he said. "We were all so worried." "Were you?" Odessa said, pleasant as sugar and just as substantial. "That's kind of you to say, Desmond." He set the tulips on the side table without asking for a vase, and he sat himself down on the couch across from her. And before he sat, he did the thing he always does, the thing I would come to know as well as I know the sound of my own truck door. He placed that leather portfolio on the coffee table between us, squared it with both hands so its edges lined up with the edge of the table, and only then did he lower himself onto the cushions. For 20 minutes, he asked all the right questions in all the right order. "How's her energy been?" he asked me as if Odessa were not sitting 3 feet away, perfectly capable of answering for herself. Odessa answered anyway. "My energy is fine, Desmond. I'm sitting right here." "Of course," he said, and smiled without missing a beat. "Has the physical therapy started?" "Next Tuesday," Odessa said. "And you're sleeping through the night now?" "Some nights," she said, and left it there, watching him with the particular stillness of a woman deciding how much rope to give a man before she pulled it back. He nodded at each answer like a man checking items off a list. And if I had not spent 35 years watching visitors come through Praise House with their hands folded and their faces arranged just so, I might have believed every word of his concern was the whole of it. Then he turned to me. "Cornelius," he said, "I actually wanted to talk to you both about something, if this is a good time." "What kind of something?" I asked. He opened the portfolio, though he did not hand me anything from it yet, just let it sit open on his knee, like a menu he wanted me to see the cover of before he read from it. "Renata and I have been thinking a lot about you two," he said, "about making sure everything is in order, especially now with everything that's happened." "What kind of order?" I asked again. "A family trust," he said. "It's just a planning tool, a way to make sure the land and the house are protected, properly managed, so that if anything else were to happen, nobody has to go through the courts to sort it out. A lot of families out here set these up. It's simply practical." "Protected from what?" I said. He smiled the way he smiles at me, wide and warm and calibrated to exactly the right temperature. "From complications, Cornelius, that's all. Court costs, delays, family disputes down the road. We just want to make sure you and Odessa are taken care of whatever comes." "And who manages this trust?" I asked. "Once it's set up." He paused just barely, the smile holding steady while something behind it recalculated. "There would be a designated trustee," he said, "someone the family trusts to handle things smoothly. We haven't finalized every detail yet. That's really something for the attorneys to work through together." I looked at that portfolio sitting open on his knee, at the tabbed pages I could not yet read the headings of. but nothing in me reached for it.
I'd like to see it in writing before I say yes to anything, I said.
Of course, he said, closing the portfolio and setting it back down, square on the table, precise as always. Take all the time you need. There's no rush at all. But he stood a moment longer than the conversation called for before he finally picked that leather case back up off my coffee table, and in the space of that one extra moment, something passed behind his eyes that had nothing warm in it whatsoever. He gathered his coat, said his goodbyes, and let himself out the same way he'd let himself in. Easy and certain, like a man who already knew how the story was going to end. I stood at the window and watched his taillights swing out of the driveway and disappear past the line of live oaks at the edge of the yard. And when I turned back around, Odessa was watching me instead of the door.
"Well," she said, "that was something, wasn't it?"
"That it was," I said, and sat back down across from her, my mind still turning over the shape of that leather portfolio, closed now and gone with him out the door. Odessa folded her hands in her lap, the way she does when she is about to say something she has already decided is true. "He's never once brought me flowers in 19 years of marrying my daughter," she said, "and tonight he brings tulips. What do you make of that, Cornelius?" "I make of it that a man doesn't bring flowers unless he's already decided he's going to ask for something," I said. She nodded slowly, watching the window where his taillights had disappeared. "And what is it he wants, do you think?" "I don't know yet," I told her, which was true as far as it went. I did not tell her the rest of it, the part that had started turning over in me the moment he said the word protected. The part that had gone straight past his face to the land itself, to 35 years of keeping that key in my pocket, to a promise I had made to myself a long time before either of us knew Desmond Pryor's name. "Did the tomatoes need staking before the next storm?" she asked after a while, changing course the way she does when she has said all she means to say on a subject for now. "They'll hold," I told her. "I checked the stakes Tuesday." "You checked them Tuesday, and it's Thursday," she said. "A lot can lean in 2 days." "Not those tomatoes," I said. "I drove them in deep." She almost smiled at that. The first real ease in her face since Desmond's car had pulled out of the drive. And we went on a while longer about ordinary things, her therapy schedule for the coming week, whether the church needed a new coffee urn before the fellowship breakfast, and underneath every one of those ordinary sentences, I could feel the other conversation sitting there, the one neither of us was having yet. Later, after I had gotten her settled for the night and turned off the lamp in the front room, I lay in bed beside her with my eyes open, looking at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark. I thought about the deacons who trained me when I was young. Gray men now long buried, and how they used to say that land held in common by a family was the one inheritance no bank could touch and no fire could burn, so long as somebody kept the deed clean and the taxes paid and the family together enough to agree on what the land was for. I thought about the Geddes place, 2 roads over, 40 acres, that had belonged to that family since 1871. Gone now, sold off piece by piece, after a single cousin in Ohio signed something he never should have signed, without asking anyone what it meant. I thought, too, about my own grandfather, a man I knew only through photographs and the handful of stories my mother told before she passed. Standing on a strip of his own land the year the county redrew a boundary line and took 11 acres of it from him on the strength of a survey he never got to see beforehand and never had the money to fight. I never met him. I only ever met the silence he left behind in my mother, the way she would go quiet herself any time land came up in conversation, and the way that silence had come down to me like a family Bible, heavy and unquestioned, until I had made it my own, without ever once deciding to. I thought about how many families on this island had lost exactly that kind of land, not to storms, not to fires, but to a signature on a page nobody had read closely enough. I thought about the word trust, and how careful a man has to be with a word that means 2 such different things depending on who is using it. Odessa shifted beside me in the dark. "You're doing that thing," she said, her voice thick with almost sleep but clear enough underneath it. "What thing?" I said. "The thing where you go quiet in a particular way, like you're carrying something heavy and don't want me to hear you carrying it. I kept my eyes on the ceiling fan, watching one blade pass, then the next, then the one after that. It's nothing, I said. Just thinking about the roof at Praise House, that flashing I never got around to. She was quiet long enough that I thought she had drifted off, and then, in the dark, without turning to face me, she said, "You are a terrible liar, Cornelius Odom. You have been a terrible liar for 38 years. I did not answer that. I let the silence sit there between us, the way I let a coat of paint sit before I put a second one over it. And after a while, her breathing slowed and evened out, and I knew she had gone under. I stayed awake a long while after that, looking at the dark shapes the ceiling fan threw across the room each time it turned, thinking about the land under this house and the land under Praise House, both about how a man could spend his whole life keeping something safe without ever once explaining to the people he loved most exactly what he was keeping it safe from. And about whether that kind of silence was protection at all, or just another name for something closer to being alone. A few days later, I drove into town for groceries. The list Odessa had written out in her careful, slower hand folded in my shirt pocket next to the key, and I was standing in the produce section of the market on Sea Island Parkway, weighing a bag of collards in one hand, when I nearly walked straight into Miss Pearl Fraser. Pearl had lived 3 houses down from us on Clement Road for going on 26 years. She had brought us a casserole the week Odessa's mother passed, and she had borrowed our extension ladder more times than either of us could count, always bringing back a plate of tea cakes as thanks she did not strictly owe. She was a decent woman and a good neighbor, and the moment she saw me, her face did something complicated, a flash of something close to guilt crossing it, before she folded it back into an easy, neighborly smile. "Cornelius," she said, "how is Odessa doing? I've been meaning to come by." "She's coming along," I told her. "Stronger every week. Doctor cleared her for the garden last Tuesday, and she's already got opinions about my tomato staking." Pearl laughed at that. A real laugh, and for a moment, the guilty flicker I'd seen cross her face was gone entirely. "That sounds like Odessa," she said. "I'm glad to hear it." Her smile held steady after that, but her eyes were doing something separate from the rest of her face, moving slightly, like she was weighing something on a scale only she could see. I set the collards down in my cart and waited the way I wait when a board on the roof gives a little more than it should, and I want to see exactly how much before I decide what to do about it. Pearl adjusted her grip on her own cart, started to say something, and stopped herself. "Cornelius, I don't know if I should say this," she said. "Say it," I told her. My voice came out easy, the same voice I use when a young man on a work crew tells me something's wrong with a pipe and doesn't want to be the one to say so. Calm is what keeps people talking. She let out a breath. "Renata and Desmond came by my place last week," she said. "They were asking about the neighborhood, about what the land out this way has been going for lately." "Is that so?" I said. My voice stayed level. Underneath it, something had gone very still. "They asked if I knew what the Wilsons got for their place last spring when they moved off to be near their daughter in Atlanta," Pearl said, her voice dropping lower now, careful, like she understood she was handing me something that mattered, whether she wanted to or not. "They mentioned something about you and Odessa maybe needing a different kind of living situation. Something more manageable is the word they used." Manageable. My grip on the cart handle tightened first in the knuckles, then climbing slow up through my forearms like a rope drawn taut. "I appreciate you telling me, Pearl," I said. "I mean that." She put her hand on my arm for just a moment, pressed once, and then pushed her own cart on toward the bread aisle. The particular relieved look of a woman who has delivered a difficult message and is glad to have it behind her. I stood there a while longer with my own cart between the collards and the tomatoes, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the same flat note they'd hummed in that hospital hallway some weeks back. Standing there with a grocery list in my pocket and my heart going harder than it had any right to go. Over a conversation about real estate, this was not surprise. Some part of me had already sketched out the shape of this back on my own couch, watching Desmond square that portfolio on my coffee table with both hands. This was something else. This was the particular cold clarity that comes when a thing you feared turns out to be exactly as bad as you feared it. No worse, no better, just confirmed, solid, real enough now to hold in your hand. They were already asking about what the land was worth. Desmond had sat in my living room talking about protection and family trusts, while 3 houses down, my own daughter was asking a neighbor what the Wilsons got per acre, and neither one of them had thought to ask what the land was worth to us. Renata had grown up on that land. She had learned to walk on the packed dirt path between our house and Prey's house, had skinned both knees on the same oyster shell driveway I still parked on every evening. And somewhere between then and now, she had started measuring it the way a stranger would in dollars per acre, instead of anything that couldn't be counted. I finished the shopping on instinct alone, barely seeing what went into the cart, an extra can of coffee I didn't need, the wrong brand of grits, and drove home through the late afternoon without turning the radio on, needing the quiet to hear myself think. My hand tightened on the steering wheel at every stop sign, the way it had tightened on that cart handle, and it did not loosen again the whole way home. Not even after I had pulled into my own driveway and sat there a full minute with the engine ticking as it cooled. I told Odessa everything on the drive up the porch steps before I even had the groceries out of the truck, and I watched her face go through the same stages mine had gone through in that produce aisle surprise, sliding into something harder and more settled. Manageable, Odessa repeated once I'd finished testing the word the way she tests a peach for ripeness before she'll buy it. That's an interesting choice of word for your own parents, isn't it? It is, I said. We did not have long to sit with it. Renata's car pulled into the driveway 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, no call ahead, no warning, just the crunch of tires on oyster shell, and then her knock, quick and businesslike, the same knock she has used since she was 16 years old and decided that knocking was a courtesy owed to strangers, not to people who raised you. She came in wearing a cream blouse and dark slacks, her hair done, her makeup precise, carrying herself like a woman who had prepared carefully for wherever she was headed next. She crossed to Odessa first and hugged her with the particular careful stiffness of someone hugging a person they are afraid of hurting or afraid of being held by. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said. "Better than I expected." "Than you expected," Odessa repeated, and smiled her sugar-sweet smile. "Well, that's something." Renata turned to me next, and I got the same brief hug, shoulder forward, duty fulfilled. Then her eyes went moving around the living room the way they always do, taking inventory without seeming to. The window that needed new weather stripping, the bookshelf Odessa keeps overfilling, the water stain on the ceiling from the roof leak I fixed 2 summers back but never quite finished painting over. "Sit down," I told her. "I'll get coffee." For 15 minutes, she asked Odessa the questions she'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over. "How's the pain, on a scale of 1 to 10, she asked. "Manageable," Odessa said. And I nearly laughed out loud at the word she chose to answer with. "Is the incision healing the way the doctors expected it to?" "The doctor seems satisfied," Odessa said. "Have you started the physical therapy yet?" "Next week," Odessa said. Renata nodded at each answer and made the right sounds, and I watched from the kitchen doorway while the coffee brewed, watched her eyes drift again and again toward the front window, toward the yard, toward the tree line, where Prey's house stood just visible past the marsh grass. The way a buyer's eyes drift toward the parts of a house an inspector hasn't cleared yet. When I brought the coffee out, she took her cup without drinking from it and said, "Actually, I wanted to talk to you both about something. There's a place in Port Royal, the Oaks. It's really lovely. Full medical staff on site, a pool, activities every day. For someone in Mom's situation coming out of surgery like this, it would be ideal." "Your mother is recovering well, right here," I said. "Dr. Renwick is pleased with her progress." "For now," Renata said. "But Daddy, you're 68. Mom just had major surgery. What happens the next time something goes wrong out here, with the nearest hospital 40 minutes away? You can't be her full-time caregiver forever, and it isn't fair to either of you to pretend you can." "I've been her husband 38 years, I said. "That's a different thing than a caregiver." "Of course," Renata said, and something flickered behind her eyes, quick and gone. The look of a woman who had a script and found herself briefly off it. I just mean professionally, managed care would take the pressure off both of you. And frankly, a property like this should be generating something by now, instead of just— She stopped herself mid-sentence, the word already half out of her mouth, before she caught it and swallowed the rest. Instead of just what I said. Instead of just sitting empty most of the year while you two struggle to keep up with it, she said, recovering fast, smooth as a stone dropped in still water, the ripples already fading before anyone could measure how deep they'd gone. But I had heard the first version. So had Odessa, sitting very still in her chair, with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and her eyes locked on her daughter's face with an expression I recognized from 38 years of watching that woman read people accurately. Renata stayed another 20 minutes circling careful ground after that, talking about the weather, about a case she was working, about nothing that mattered. And when she finally left, hugging Odessa again at the door and promising to call during the week, I stood on the porch and watched her pull out of the driveway with her phone already at her ear before she'd reached the road. I went back inside. Odessa had not moved from her chair. She said, generating something. Odessa said, not looking at me. Not managing something, not helping with something, generating. Like this house was a piece of equipment sitting idle in a warehouse. I know, I said. She's not here to visit us, Cornelius, Odessa said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very certain. She's here to appraise us. That night, after Odessa's breathing had gone slow and even beside me, I got up and went to the hall closet where a metal toolbox sits on the top shelf holding things too particular to keep anywhere else. Underneath the spare washers and a coil of picture wire, I found what I was looking for, a leather-bound ledger book I had bought 30 years back for logging maintenance at Praise House and never filled past the first dozen pages, the leather gone soft and dark at the corners from handling. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down under the one light I'd left burning, and I opened to a clean page and wrote the date at the top in the same block letters I use for every repair log I've ever kept. Cracked shingle room 4, loose hinge side door, Renata Odom Pryor. Saturday afternoon, generating something. I wrote what Renata had said word for word, as close as memory would let me get it. A property like this should be generating something by now. I wrote down what Odessa had said afterward. I wrote the time Renata had arrived and the time she'd left and the fact that her phone was already at her ear before she'd reached the end of the driveway. I sat looking at what I'd written for a long while. It was not much 4 sentences on an otherwise empty page, but something about seeing Renata's words in my own handwriting made them heavier than they'd been floating loose in the air of my living room. A thing spoken can be denied later, softened walked back with enough charm. A thing written down in a man's own hand with a date attached to it is a different kind of thing altogether. My grandfather never got the chance to write down what was done to his 11 acres. Nobody thought to ask him for his side of it, and by the time anybody might have, the silence had already become the whole of his story. I was not going to let that happen twice in the same family. I closed the ledger and set it back in the toolbox before I went back to bed, careful not to wake her, though. When I slid back under the covers, she stirred anyway and reached out without opening her eyes and rested her hand flat against my chest until her breathing found its rhythm again. I lay there a long while after that, staring at the ceiling fan before sleep finally came for me too. I did not know that night how many more pages that ledger would fill before the year was out. I only knew that I was done letting things pass through this house without leaving a mark behind them the way water passes through a channel without changing the shape of the rock no matter how many years it runs. 20 years before that night, I was up on this same Praise House roof in weather considerably worse than any I'd have chosen to work in, patching a section that had started leaking into the fellowship hall 2 Sundays running, and the sky over Saint Helena had gone the color of a day-old bruise since noon. The rain held off until I was 3/4 through, and then it came, all at once, the way low-country storms do. No warning beyond a change in the smell of the air, salt and ozone and something green underneath it. And I was still 40 minutes from finished when the first real sheet of it came sideways off the marsh. I made the decision a younger man makes and a wiser one thinks twice about. I stayed up there working fast under a stretched tarp because a wedding was booked in that fellowship hall in 9 days, and a fresh leak now meant water stains on the very ceiling the bride's mother had already asked me twice about. By the time I finished and climbed down soaked through to the skin, my hands pruned and aching from the cold rain, full dark had come on, and the parking lot was empty except for my own truck, sitting under the one working security light. I went inside to gather my tools from the fellowship hall, moving quiet out of habit more than necessity, the whole building holding that particular hush that comes over a place once everyone meant to be in it has already gone home. I heard something then, a low murmur of voices near the side entrance, and I stopped where I stood, one hand still on my toolbox. I told myself it was nothing, maybe Deacon Ashby's father who used to walk the grounds some evenings, or a couple of teenagers who'd wandered up from the road looking for somewhere dry to wait out the rain. I went back to packing my tools. The voices came again, closer this time, low and careful in the particular way people speak when they believe themselves entirely alone. A thin line of yellow light showed under the door to the small side office the deacons used for counting the offering, a room that should have gone dark 2 hours before with everyone else. Something in the rhythm of those voices, hushed and businesslike at once, made the hair go up on the back of my neck before my mind had caught up to why. I set my toolbox down without a sound and stepped closer to the wall. Close enough now to make out that there were 2 of them talking, and that neither one belonged to anybody I expected to find inside Praise House at that hour. I can still hear it 20 years on. The way you hear things that reshape the rest of your life, clear enough to play back whenever you close your eyes and ask them to. "We've got the old plats from '61, one voice was saying. Unhurried a voice, used to being listened to without argument. Most of that acreage along the title creek was never formally probated past the original grantees. No clear chain of title past 3 generations back. County can classify it as heirs' property in default, and once it's in default long enough, it reads as abandoned on paper. Abandoned land reverts." The second voice was younger, quicker, with the particular smoothness of a man selling something he believes in only exactly as much as it profits him to believe in it. And Tideline picks it up at the tax sale. "Clean," he said. "No family showing up to contest something they don't even know is happening." "That's the beauty of it," the first voice said. "These families think a deed from 1900-something means the land's settled forever. Half of them have never even seen the actual plat, couldn't tell you their own boundary lines within 20 feet. Long as nobody's checking the courthouse records for a filing, most of these families don't know exists. I can move the boundary on the working plat 2 feet here, 3 feet there. Nothing anybody would flag unless they were already looking for it." "How many parcels are we talking?" the younger voice asked. "Depends how thorough I want to be about it," the first voice said, and there was something almost pleasant in the way he said it, a craftsman talking through a job he took some pride in. "The Geddes tract, the old Simmons-Odom line along the creek, maybe 6-7 parcels total once I've gone through the whole book. Tideline's looking at close to 40 acres if this goes the way I think it will." My own name in that man's mouth landed in me like a dropped tool, sudden and loud in a quiet room. Though he had said it as easily as he might have said any other word in that sentence, no different weight attached to it at all, which was somehow worse than if he had. I stood very still against that wall, my wet clothes gone cold against my skin, and listened to the rest of it pass between them. Numbers and dates and the particular businesslike ease of men discussing something they had clearly discussed before, more than once, in rooms exactly like this one. I stood pressed against that wall a long while after they'd finished talking, long enough that my knees had started to ache from holding still long enough to hear papers being gathered and a briefcase snapping shut. I eased back from the wall the same way I'd come, careful with my own weight on that old floor, and I was nearly to the fellowship hall door when a shape passed close by the side entrance in the rain, silhouetted a moment against a car's headlights out in the lot. It was Deacon Ezekiel Simmons out in that weather at that hour, exchanging a few quiet words with the younger of the 2 voices I'd just heard through the wall, an umbrella between them, before the deacon turned and walked off toward his own car without once looking back at Praise House. I did not think much of it in that moment. A deacon caught out in the rain, same as anybody, I told myself. A chance meeting that meant nothing at all.
I did not have room that night to carry more than the one thing I'd already picked up. I drove home soaked through and said nothing to Odessa, who was asleep by the time I came in. And I lay in bed a long while, with my eyes open, running that man's voice back through my head. The old Simmons-Odom line along the creek, 6 or 7 parcels, 40 acres, families who did not know a filing existed that could take the ground out from under them while they slept, the same way it had taken 11 acres from my own grandfather a generation before I was even born. On the strength of a survey, nobody thought to show him until it was already done. I thought about Reverend Gadsden's father and his father before him keeping this praise house standing through hurricanes and hard winters and years when the collection plate barely covered the light bill, so that a family who could not always agree on much of anything else could still agree on where they came from. I thought about how easily that could be undone now, not by wind or fire, but by a pencil moving 2 feet on a survey map in a county office nobody in my family had ever thought to walk into and ask questions. I did not know yet what I was going to do about it. I only knew that I was not going to do nothing, and that whatever I decided, I would need more than the sound of 2 voices through a wall before anyone would believe a word of it. A man's memory could be argued with. A man's memory 20 years from now could be called old age or grudge or a story grown taller with the telling. I would need something a memory alone could never give me. A few days later, I noticed Tillman's county truck back in the Praise House lot on a Wednesday afternoon, parked beside the finance committee's usual cars. And when I asked Deacon Ashby about it, he told me the county had offered free of charge to survey the church's own boundary line as a goodwill gesture ahead of some anniversary or another. I did not say what I knew. I only nodded and went about my work, and I made sure to carry the small camera I use for documenting repair needs, the one I've carried in my coveralls pocket for as long as I've had this job, close at hand that whole afternoon. The meeting broke early. I watched Tillman step out to take a phone call in the parking lot, leaving a folder of working plats spread open on the desk in that same side office, and I did what a caretaker does when he finds a mess needing tending. I went in to straighten up. My hands were shaking badly enough that I was certain the pictures would come out blurred beyond any use, but I held that little camera as steady as I could over each page, the old plat from 61 on the left, the working copy on the right. And even to my eye, no surveyor's eye at all, the boundary lines did not match. 2 feet here, 3 feet there, same as he'd said through the wall. I got 4 clear photographs before I heard his footsteps coming back down the hall, and I closed the folder square the way I'd found it, and I was out of that office and halfway down the corridor with my mop bucket before he ever reached the door. I did not go home first. I did not stop to think too long about it either, though thinking too long about things has always been my particular failing, the same way Odessa likes to tease me that I mop one section at a time and refuse to move to the next until I'm certain the first is clean. This was not a night for that kind of slowness. 4 photographs in my pocket and a family's whole future sitting somewhere on a working plat 2 feet off from where it ought to be, and I drove. That evening I drove out past the Geddes track to a small cinder block house set back off the dirt road where I knew a family by the name of Ravenel had been raising their grandchildren on land that had come down to them the same way most of ours had through generations, who never saw the need for a lawyer when a handshake and a deed box had always been good enough before. Miss Adele Ravenel answered the door in her housecoat, wary the way any woman her age has learned to be wary of a stranger showing up after dark, until she recognized me from Praise House and let me in. I sat at her kitchen table with the photographs spread out between us under a bare bulb, and I told her everything I had heard through that wall, word for word, the way I'd have wanted somebody to tell it to me if the situation had been turned around. She studied those photographs a long while, running one finger slow along the boundary line on the old plat, then the new one, before she set them both down flat on the table. 20 years I've been paying taxes on this land, she said quiet-like. She was working the arithmetic of it out loud. 20 years, and they'd have taken it on a technicality nobody bothered to tell me existed.
Her grandson sat in the next room doing homework at a card table, a serious boy of about 11 who kept glancing our way without quite looking at the pages, young enough not to understand exactly what was being decided about his own future in that kitchen, old enough to know it mattered. Miss Adele did not cry and did not shout. She got up, made a phone call to a legal aid office in Beaufort that handled cases exactly like this one. Heirs property, contested boundaries. The particular Tangle Gullah families have been fighting through courts for generations. And by the end of that call, she had an appointment set for the following week. I do not know everything that happened after that, only the shape of it as it reached me secondhand. The legal aid attorney pulled records, found the same discrepancies I had found, and within a month, the matter had been referred up to the state auditors and investigators, moving through county offices asking questions that made certain people considerably less comfortable than they had been. I drove past the Ravenel place one more time before the year was out, slow, not stopping, and I saw that boy out in the yard, tossing a ball against the side of the house, over and over, in the particular rhythm of a child with no idea how close he'd come to losing the ground he was standing on. I did not stop the truck. I did not need him to know my name, and there was a particular kind of peace in that, a debt paid clean, with nobody left owing anybody anything, not even the knowledge of who to thank. I have thought many times since about whether that was wisdom or simple cowardice wearing wisdom's clothes, a slow man's excuse for never once having to stand in a room and be looked at for what he'd done. I still do not have a clean answer for it. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected trouble like that to move. State auditors came through the county offices twice more, interviewing clerks and pulling files, and by late autumn, the newspaper in Beaufort ran a short item, 3 paragraphs buried well past the front page, about a county surveyor and a developer's representative facing charges connected to falsified boundary records affecting several parcels of historically black-owned land along the tidal creek. Neither man's name meant anything to most readers, tucked between a piece about the high school football schedule and an advertisement for a hardware store closing sale. Both names meant everything to me. The Ravenel land held. So did the Geddes tract and 4 other parcels besides, all of it quietly returned to its rightful lines on paper. The whole ordeal wrapped up with the particular tidiness that powerful people prefer when they've been caught at something they'd rather the public not examine too closely. Tideline Coastal Group issued a brief statement about a regrettable lapse in due diligence and withdrew its interest in the tract entirely. I read that statement twice in the newspaper, sitting at this same kitchen table, and found nothing in it worth the ink they'd spent printing it. Tillman lost his position with the county, and I heard later his license to practice surveying anywhere in the state. Ashworth simply vanished from Tideline's letterhead within the year, the way men like that tend to vanish, upward and sideways, into some other company's org chart, never quite landing anywhere long enough to be held to account for what came before. I should have let it end there. Most of me did. But I went back to Pray's house one more evening that November, later than usual, finishing a repair to the fellowship hall door that had been sticking on its hinge for weeks, and I heard voices again, near that same side office, low and urgent, in a way that had none of the business-like ease I remembered from the first time. "It's done," a voice was saying, and I recognized it after a moment as belonging to the younger man, the developer's man, Ashworth, though his voice had lost all its earlier polish. "They know somebody tipped them on which meetings to avoid, which families to watch. If they trace it back to you, Ezekiel, there's nothing I can do for you. You understand that." I stood very still in the dark hallway, my hand gone cold on the doorframe. "I never asked for much," the second voice said, and this one I knew without needing a moment to place it. Knew it. The way you know your own name, the voice of a man I had sat beside in these very pews every Sunday of my adult life, Deacon Ezekiel Simmons. "My wife's treatments cost more than this whole church takes in over a year, Grant. I told you which nights the finance committee met and which families weren't paying close attention to their own paperwork. That's all I ever did. I never touched a single map." "You knew what it was for," Ashworth said. "I knew what my wife needed," Simmons said, and his voice cracked down the middle on that last word.
The sound of a man who had been holding something together with both hands for longer than his hands could manage. I did not go into that office. I did not confront either one of them. I stood in the dark hallway of the building I had kept for 15 years at that point, and I listened to the sound of Praise House settling around me the way it settles every night, old wood ticking as it cooled, the ventilation humming its same low note, and I did not move until I heard both cars pull out of the lot, one after the other, into the dark. I stayed in that hallway a long while after the sound of their engines had faded past the tree line. The building held its usual quiet around me, unbothered the way a place stays exactly itself, no matter what has just been said inside its walls. I did not turn on a single light. I locked the side door, checked it twice the way I always do, and walked out into the parking lot alone. I never told anyone what I heard that night. Not the legal aid attorney, not Reverend Gadsden's father, who was pastor then, not Odessa, not for 20 years. Not until the night I finally wrote it in a red ledger book at my own kitchen table. Deacon Simmons died 3 years later, his heart, the doctor said, and the whole congregation turned out for the funeral, and I sat in my usual pew and sang the same hymns as everyone else, and said nothing, because by then I had decided rightly or wrongly that a dying man's failure did not need to become the last thing his grandchildren remembered about him, and that a wife's cancer treatments were not nothing, even measured against a wrong that had, in the end, been caught and undone before it could take anything permanent from anybody. I told myself a man could be two things at once, a betrayer and a husband who loved somebody enough to break himself over her, and that judging which one counted more was not a job I had been given. I thought of my own vows to Odessa, and I wondered, not for the last time, what I might have done in Ezekiel Simmons's place with a wife I loved dying by inches and a stranger offering the one thing that might slow it down. I did not like how long it took me to be certain of my own answer. I do not know to this day if that was mercy or simply one more silence I chose because silence had always come easier to me than the alternative. That was 20 years ago. Now I was sitting at my own kitchen table again, a different folder in front of me this time, 14 pages instead of a handful of falsified plats, my own daughter's signature waiting to be added to it instead of a stranger's, and I found myself no longer certain that the same choice would serve me twice. 2 weeks after that afternoon in my living room, Desmond and Renata came by together on a Sunday evening, the light going soft and gold across the marsh, the way it does in late July. And this time there were no tulips, no fruit basket, no small talk stretched out to soften what was coming. Desmond carried a leather portfolio, the same one as before, but thicker now, and he set it on my coffee table with both hands the way he always does, squared to the edges before he sat down across from me. "We had our attorney draw this up properly," Renata said, her voice businesslike, the register she uses for things she's rehearsed. On the drive over, "It's a durable power of attorney and a family land trust combined. Standard language, nothing unusual. 14 pages, everything spelled out clearly this time." "I'd like to read it," I said. "Of course," Desmond said. "Take all the time you need." He leaned back into the couch cushions, unhurried, a man confident in his own paperwork. "It's really quite straightforward once you're through it. Our attorneys handled dozens of these for families in similar situations." "Similar situations," I said. "Health scares," he said. "Aging parents. Nothing unusual about any of it, Cornelius. This is what responsible families do." I opened to the first page and started in the way I read everything, one section at a time, making sure I understood each part before I moved to the next. Renata refilled her coffee she hadn't touched. Odessa sat quiet in her reading chair with her hands folded, watching the room the way she watches a pot she suspects is about to boil over, saying nothing, yet waiting. Desmond checked his phone once, then set it face down on his knee when he caught Odessa watching him do it, the leather case still sitting square on the coffee table between us, like something waiting to be admired. Renata's phone buzzed against the coffee table a few minutes in, and she glanced at the screen, her whole posture changing in the space of a second, shoulders drawing up toward her ears. "I need to take this," she said, already standing, already halfway to the front porch before anyone answered her. Through the window I could see her pacing the length of the porch rail, one hand pressed flat against her forehead, her voice too low to carry through the glass, though the shape of it sounded more like an argument than a conversation. Her free hand cutting the air twice in a gesture I'd seen her use since she was a teenager, the one she makes when she's trying to convince somebody of something she doesn't fully believe herself. She came back in a few minutes later, her face composed again, careful the way a room looks after someone has hurried to straighten it before company arrives. "Everything all right at work?" Odessa asked her, mild as anything, the question of a mother who already suspects the answer isn't the one she's about to get. "Fine," Renata said. "Just a case that won't settle itself. Sorry about that." She sat back down and picked up her coffee like nothing at all had interrupted the evening, and I went back to reading, though I noted the way her hands stayed a little too still in her lap after that. The particular stillness of someone working hard to look unbothered, and the way she glanced twice more at the phone face down beside her before the evening was through. Quick, involuntary glances. She seemed almost angry at herself for making. The language in the main body was exactly what Renata had described standard authorization for her to act on our behalf in financial and medical matters if either of us became incapacitated. The word itself defined, carefully requiring a physician's certification, nothing a person could simply decide about another person on their own say-so. There was language, too, about who would serve as trustee of the land itself. Renata named first Desmond as backup should anything happen to her. That part I understood. That part I could have signed without much trouble at all. Then I turned to page 7, to a section marked 4 subsection B, tucked between 2 paragraphs about healthcare proxies, in language dense enough that I had to read it twice to be certain I'd understood it the first time. The agent shall have full authority to determine the principal's place of residence, including the authority to arrange for residential care placement if the agent determines in good faith that such placement is in the principal's best interest. I read it a third time slower, my finger under each word the way I'd read contracts my whole life, waiting for the sentence to soften on repetition, the way most legal language eventually does once you've circled it enough times. This one did not soften. It only got clearer, the meaning of it settling into me the way cold settles into a house after the power's gone out. Slow at first, then all at once, impossible to ignore. I set the page down flat on my knee. My hand had gone still on it, and I made myself keep it still, made myself not let the rest of my body show what that one sentence had just done inside my chest. Because Desmond was watching me read it, watching my face. The particular, careful way a man watches for a reaction he's hoping not to see. The next morning I drove up to Beaufort, 40 minutes north along Highway 21, to a small brick office building Reverend Gadsden had pointed me toward after church the week before, when I had asked him, careful not to say too much, if he knew of any lawyer around who handled land matters for families like ours. Talk to Julian Ravenel, he'd told me. Young man, but he knows heirs property law better than most attorneys twice his age. Does right by people. The name Ravenel landed familiar somewhere in the back of my mind as I climbed the stairs to the second-floor office, though I could not immediately place why the way a smell sometimes carries you halfway back to a memory before letting you finish the trip. His assistant showed me straight back, no waiting, and Julian Ravenel stood to shake my hand when I came in. A man somewhere in his late 30s, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a stack of files organized with more care than his desk otherwise suggested. "Mr. Odom," he said, "have a seat. Tell me what's brought you in." So I told him. The stroke, the visits from Desmond, the tulips and the fruit baskets, the way the conversation had shifted over months from concern to something colder. The trust document, the clause I'd found on page 7 the night before, reading it a third time under the kitchen light until the words stopped making any more sense the longer I stared at them. I handed him the 14 pages, and he read through them without interruption, his pen resting untouched beside his legal pad the whole time, his eyes moving steady down each page, the way mine had the night before. He got to page 7. I watched something shift in his face, a tightening around the jaw, and he read the section twice, then flipped back 2 pages to check something else, then forward again before he finally set the document down and took off his glasses. "Mr. Odom," he said, I'm going to explain this plainly, without the lawyer language, if that's all right with you. That's exactly what I need, I told him. The main body of this document is standard, he said. Durable power of attorney giving your daughter authority over financial and medical decisions if you become incapacitated. In South Carolina, incapacitated has a specific legal meaning. It requires a physician's certification that you lack the capacity to make or communicate decisions. You can't just be old. You can't just have had a health scare. There has to be a formal medical determination. That part is fine. Section 4, subsection B is not fine. He tapped the page. The residential care placement clause gives your daughter the authority to determine where you live if she believes in her own good faith judgment that a different living arrangement serves your best interest. Mr. Odom, that phrase, good faith, is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It means she doesn't need a court order. She doesn't need a second medical opinion. She needs only to believe she's acting in your interest, and under this document, she is also the one who gets to decide what your interest is. Can she be argued out of that decision once it's made? I asked. If it came to that? Not easily, Julian said, and not quickly. You'd be arguing against a document you signed yourself, which is always the hardest kind of argument to win, no matter how good the lawyer standing next to you happens to be. And the land, I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I meant it to. If she moved you and your wife into assisted living under this authority and financial control had already passed to her as well, she would have the legal standing to sell the property to fund your care. Courts have upheld arrangements like that in this state more than once. Julian's eyes stayed steady on mine, kind but entirely honest. If you sign this, your daughter could have you and Mrs. Odom relocated within months, and the land on the market not long after legally, without needing your consent again, because you would have already given it once, right here. I sat with that a long moment, the office fan turning slow overhead, a lawnmower going somewhere outside on the street below, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning going on entirely undisturbed by what had just been said inside that room. One more thing, Julian said, before you go. This kind of document, drafted this specifically, this carefully, usually doesn't arrive alone. In my experience, families who prepare paperwork like this are often preparing something else alongside it, in parallel, in case the paperwork doesn't get signed the way they're hoping. I'd keep both eyes open not just on what's in front of you. I did not fully understand what he meant by that not that morning, and he did not explain further, already moving on to gather my copy of the document back into its folder, his mind clearly already turning toward whatever came next on his morning's list. I thanked him and shook his hand again at the door, his grip firm and unhurried, and I drove back down toward the island with the folder on the seat beside me. About halfway home, I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the highway, put it in park, and sat there a while, with both hands on the wheel and the engine ticking as it cooled the marsh grass out past the guardrail, bending slow in a wind I couldn't feel through the closed windows. A heron standing motionless in the shallows, like it had nowhere else in the world it needed to be. I did not move for a long while. I did not think anything in particular, no clear sentence forming in my head. Just the size of what I'd learned, settling into me the way water finds the low places in a yard after a long, hard rain, filling in every hollow I hadn't known was there until the water showed it to me. That handshake at the door lasted a beat or two longer than the moment strictly called for, Julian's grip firm around mine, but his eyes somewhere else, somewhere back a good 20 years by the look of it, and I could tell before he said another word that he was deciding something. "Mr. Odom," he said, "before you go, there's something I should tell you, and I've been sitting on whether to say it since the moment you walked in." I waited, the fan overhead still turning its same slow circle, the lawnmower outside finally cutting off somewhere down the street. In my experience, a man who needs that much runway before he speaks usually has something worth hearing. "I grew up out near the Geddes tract," he said, "Ravenel. My grandmother raised me and my sister after our parents passed young." Adele Ravenel. Does that name mean anything to you? Something shifted low in my chest. Slow at first, the way a tide turns before you can see it moving. "It does," I said carefully.
It means a great deal, actually. I was 11 years old the year the county tried to take our land, he said. I didn't understand most of what was happening at the time, only that my grandmother started making phone calls and men in suits started coming around asking questions, and then one day it was just over and everybody acted like it had never nearly happened at all. It took me years to piece together the whole story, mostly from things my grandmother let slip when she thought I wasn't listening closely. A man had come to our kitchen table one evening with photographs. He never gave my grandmother his name. She never asked for it either, or if she did, she never told me. She used to say he'd earned the right not to be thanked, and I remember thinking even as a boy that was a strange thing for a grown woman to say about a stranger. I stood in that doorway with my hands still half raised from the handshake, unable for a moment to make my voice do what I needed it to do. The old ledger discipline in me wanting to write this down somewhere before it could slip away, though there was nothing in that office to write it down in. I thought of the ball that boy had been tossing against the side of his grandmother's house the last time I drove past, over and over in that same steady rhythm. And I thought of how a grown man's careful sentences now carried the same rhythm underneath them. Patient, deliberate, the kind of patience that gets built into a person early or not at all. I've asked around over the years, Julian said, quietly, the way you ask about something you're not sure you're even allowed to be curious about. I became a lawyer partly because of that night, because I decided somebody ought to understand this land law well enough that families like mine never had to depend on a stranger's kindness again. I never found out who that man was, though I asked my grandmother about him more times than she cared to answer. Not until about 10 minutes ago, when you mentioned Praise House and something about the way you carry yourself, the way you read a document one line at a time, patient, thorough, like you weren't going to move to the next sentence until you'd understood the one in front of you completely. That was you, wasn't it? He said, at our kitchen table 20 years ago. I did not answer right away. Some part of me wanted to deny it out of the same old habit, the reflex of 35 years spent staying out of any room's attention, but Julian was watching me with an expression that made denial feel like the smaller, meaner choice. And I was tired, in that moment, of being the smaller, meaner version of myself. It was, I said. Julian let out a breath that seemed to have been sitting in him a long while, and something in his shoulders came down that I hadn't noticed was held up until it wasn't anymore. You don't owe me anything, I told him, my voice not quite steady. Whatever help you're giving me now, that's a separate matter entirely. You'd have taken my case regardless. He shook his head slow. With respect, Mr. Odom, I don't see it that way at all. You don't owe me anything either. You're not collecting a debt right now. You're just now getting to see what you planted 20 years ago finally come up out of the ground. We stood there a moment longer, in that doorway, two men who had shared one kitchen table's worth of consequence without ever once, until that morning, having shared a room. I'll call you the moment I have anything more on that other matter I mentioned, Julian said finally, his voice returning to something more like its usual business register, though his eyes hadn't quite finished with the rest of it. And Mr. Odom, I meant what I said, both eyes open. I nodded and shook his hand one more time, and this time I held on to it a beat longer than the moment called for, too. The way you hold on to something you're not entirely sure you'll get the chance to hold on to again. Reverend Gadsden came by Praise House that same week on a Thursday afternoon, while I was up on a ladder replacing a section of gutter that had finally given out after years of me promising myself I'd get to it. He stood at the bottom, holding the ladder steady without being asked, the way he's done since he was ordained 15 years back, a man who never seemed to think any task beneath the dignity of his collar. "Got a minute, Cornelius, once you're down from there?" he said. I finished the section I was on and climbed down, wiping my hands on my coveralls, and we sat together on the bench outside the fellowship hall. The same bench where 20 years before another visitor had found me in the dark, asking questions I hadn't been ready to answer either. Gadsden didn't know about that bench's history. I wasn't about to tell him. The board's been talking, he said, about the anniversary celebration this watch night. 50 years since the congregation first organized formally as a body, records and deed and all. and the elders want to use the occasion to recognize some people who've given this church more than anyone ever properly thanked them for." I nodded, not yet seeing where this was headed, or perhaps seeing it and not wanting to, the way a man sometimes sees a storm building on the horizon and keeps right on with his afternoon chores anyway, as if not looking at it directly might slow it down. "Your name came up," he said. "Came up how I asked." Old Deacon Whitfield remembered something from years back before my time here about state investigators coming through and asking questions connected to some trouble with the land trouble that got resolved quietly and never fully explained to the congregation. He'd always suspected somebody close to the church had a hand in how that got discovered. He asked me to look into the old session minutes, and between those and a few careful conversations with people who remembered that year, "Cornelius, it isn't hard to arrive at your name. Deacon Ashby remembered you carrying a little camera around that whole autumn. Said he never thought much of it at the time." My chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the ladder work I'd just come down from. 20 years I had let that story stay buried, and here it was surfacing on its own in a conversation I hadn't started and couldn't have stopped from happening even if I'd wanted to. "I'd rather that stayed quiet," I told him. "I mean that, Reverend. Whatever you all are thinking of doing, I'd rather it not include me standing up in front of anybody." Gadsden studied me a long moment, the particular patient study of a man used to sitting with people through their discomfort rather than rushing past it. "Can I ask why," he said, "most men wouldn't turn away a little recognition after carrying something like that alone for 20 years? "I've got enough sitting on my plate right now without adding a spotlight to it," I said, which was true as far as it went, though it wasn't the whole truth, and I suspected he could hear that in how carefully I'd worded it. "I've never been a man who does well with a room full of eyes on him, Reverend. That's the truth of it, too. I did what I did because it needed doing, not because I wanted my name attached to it afterward." "I won't pretend I understand everything you're carrying," Gadsden said. "But I'll tell you what I can promise. Nothing gets decided or announced without your say-so, not while I have any influence over it. The board's patient. They've waited 20 years without knowing. They can wait a while longer." I appreciate that I told him and meant it. "How much longer are we talking?" I asked. "A month," he said. "Maybe 2 if I can manage it. The board meets again after the new year, regardless whether we've made an announcement or not." He stood brushing off the back of his trousers and looked out toward the marsh a moment before he looked back at me. "I'll hold them off as long as I reasonably can," he said. "But Cornelius, I want you to understand something plainly. Once watch night comes and goes this year, whatever's decided or not, it gets a good deal harder to keep a 50-year story quiet in a congregation this size. People talk after a night like that. They always have. It's the one night of the year everybody in this community is in the same room at the same time, remembering out loud together. Stories have a way of finding their footing on watch night whether anybody planned for them to or not." I understood him. I did not say so out loud, but I understood him completely. And as he walked back toward his car unhurried the same way he'd walked in, I sat a while longer on that bench, with my gutter tools still spread out on the ground beside me, thinking about how many clocks I now seemed to be running against at once. Julian's warning about paperwork that didn't travel alone, Gadsden's warning about a congregation's memory, finding its footing, all of it ticking down toward the same December night, though not one of those clocks so far was ticking in a direction I had any confidence I was ready for. Desmond and Renata came by again on the first Sunday in December, no call ahead this time either. And when I opened the door, there were no flowers, no fruit basket, no leather portfolio even. Just the 2 of them standing on my porch in matching dark coats against the December chill, breath showing white in the cold air. And something in their faces told me before either one said a word that this visit was going to be different from the ones before it. Odessa was already sitting up straight in her reading chair when they came in, her hands folded in her lap, the particular way they fold when she has decided ahead of time exactly how a conversation is going to go, regardless of what anybody else brings into the room. She'd had her hair set that morning, though it wasn't a Sunday for church, and I understood without her saying so that she'd dressed for this the way a person dresses for something they intend to win. "Sit down," she told them before either of them had finished taking off their coats. "Both of you." They sat. Renata perched on the edge of the couch cushion the way she used to sit as a girl waiting to be excused from the dinner table, and Desmond settled beside her with a stillness that looked practiced rather than natural, his hands folded loose in his lap. No portfolio this time to give them somewhere else to be. "We wanted to check in." Renata started, her voice carrying the same rehearsed warmth as always, about whether you'd had a chance to think more about.
"I've thought about it plenty," Odessa said, cutting her off clean, her voice calm in the particular way deep water is calm. Calm on the surface, considerable weight moving underneath it. "And I want to say something to you directly, Renata, since your father seems determined to keep being polite about it. You want this land. You want what it's worth. And you've dressed that wanting up in enough talk about protection and responsibility that you've nearly convinced yourself it isn't what it is." "Mom, that's not fair," Renata said, her chin coming up the way it used to when she was 16 and caught in something.
"Isn't it?" Odessa said. "Then tell me plainly, right now, sitting in this room, what exactly are you protecting us from?" Renata opened her mouth, and nothing came out of it for a moment, a rare enough thing for a woman who argues cases for a living, that I found myself watching her face instead of listening for her words, watching the way her jaw worked before any sound came through it. "From the courts," Desmond said, stepping in smooth as he always does, filling the silence his wife had left open. "From a situation where neither of you can make decisions and everything drags through probate for months, costing thousands of dollars nobody in this family can afford to lose. We are trying to make this easier, not harder." "Easier for who?" Odessa said, and let that question sit in the room a long moment before she went on. "Because from where I'm sitting, Desmond, it hasn't made anything easier for us. It's made every visit into an appraisal instead of a conversation. My husband hasn't slept a full night in weeks. I have watched that happen to him, and I want you both to understand that I have been watching very closely." "Mom, I love you," Renata said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word love, the first unguarded sound I'd heard from her in months. "This isn't about not loving you." "Then what is it about Odessa?" said gently now, gentler than anything she'd said yet, which somehow made it land harder than the sharpness before it had. "Because I would very much like to believe you, Renata. I have wanted to believe you since the day you were born." Renata's phone rang then, cutting straight through whatever was about to come next, loud in that quiet room, and she flinched at the sound of it the way a person flinches at something they'd been half expecting and dreading in equal measure. "I need to take this," she said, already on her feet, already moving toward the front door before anyone had a chance to object, leaving her mother's question hanging unanswered in the air behind her. I looked at Desmond once she'd gone. He was watching the door she'd just gone through with an expression I couldn't quite place. Something closer to calculation than concern. And when he caught me looking, he smoothed it back into the familiar, practiced warmth so quickly I might have imagined the rest of it if I hadn't spent a lifetime learning to trust exactly what my own eyes showed me. She was out on the porch a long moment longer than the length of most calls, her voice too low through the window glass to make out actual words, only the shape of urgency underneath them, one hand pressed flat against the porch rail, like she needed something solid to hold on to while she talked. When she finally came back in, her face composed again in that careful, practiced way, she set her phone down on the side table instead of slipping it back into her coat pocket, distracted, her hand already reaching for the coffee cup she'd left untouched instead. And none of us, in that moment, thought anything more of it than that. The phone lit up on the side table while Renata was still out on the porch, screen glowing bright in the dim afternoon light of the living room, and Odessa, sitting closest to it, glanced down out of nothing more than habit, the way anybody glances at a light suddenly appearing nearby. I watched her face change. She did not reach for the phone. She did not need to. Whatever showed on that screen was large enough to read from where she sat, and I watched her read it twice before she looked back up. Her expression gone very still and very careful, the powdered sugar composure she usually keeps ready for company entirely gone from it. "Cornelius," she said quiet, not moving her lips much. "Come look at this before it goes dark again." I crossed the room and leaned down beside her chair, careful to keep my own face turned mostly toward the window in case Desmond happened to look up. The message was from someone saved simply as Terrence Firm, and it read, "Underwriting call moved to 9 tomorrow. If we can't show real progress on the Odom transfer this week, Meridian pulls the credit line, and we're both looking for new offices by February. Need this closed. Please." I read it a second time to be certain I had it right. Odessa read it a third time beside me, her jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle working in her cheek, a tightness I recognized from every hard conversation we'd ever had at this same kitchen table over 38 years.
"This isn't about protecting us at all," Odessa said, so quiet it was barely more than breath. "This is about keeping her own law firm's lights on."
"How long do you think?" she asked me. "How long has she been carrying this and smiling at us over coffee like nothing was wrong at all?"
"I don't know," I told her. "Long enough to learn how to do it well."
I did not answer right away. Desmond sat across from us, oblivious, checking something on his own phone, entirely unaware of the small earthquake that had just moved through the room, 3 feet from where he was sitting. I understood in that moment that whatever composure Renata had been performing for months, it was sitting on top of something considerably more desperate than either of us had guessed. A woman drowning quietly enough that she'd nearly convinced her own parents the water didn't reach past her ankles. I sat back down, slowly, my mind already moving somewhere else entirely, toward the folder still resting on my own lap, the copy of the trust document Desmond had left with us weeks before. I opened it without quite meaning to, flipping toward the back where the notary's page sat, the seal and signature block I'd skimmed past too quickly the first time, more concerned then with the language on page 7 than with anything printed near the end. The notarization date sat printed clean at the bottom of that page in blue ink small enough that I had to hold it closer to the lamp to be certain. October the 14th. I sat with that date a long moment, working the arithmetic of it, the slow, careful way I work everything. The way that has always made Odessa tease me about mopping one section before I'll move to the next. Desmond had brought this document to us on a Sunday evening in late November, calling it freshly drawn up, standard language, nothing unusual. Our attorney handled it just this week. But the notarization sitting in blue ink at the bottom of the final page told a different story entirely. A story that put this document signed, sealed, and finished sitting in a drawer somewhere for the better part of 6 weeks before anyone had thought to bring it through my front door. They had not come to discuss anything with us that November evening. There had never been a version of that Sunday where the document was still open for our opinions on it. The discussing had already happened somewhere else, without us, long before Desmond ever squared that leather portfolio on my coffee table, and every question he'd asked us since, every "take all the time you need," had been offered to 2 people who no longer had any real time left to take. The room went very quiet around me. I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen, the particular tick of the mantel clock Odessa's mother had left us, the sound of Renata's voice still murmuring faint through the window glass, and none of it seemed to be happening in the same room I was sitting in anymore. I set the folder closed on my knee and looked at nothing in particular for a while. The way a man looks at nothing when he needs a moment before his face is fit to be seen by anybody else. The front door opened. Renata came back in, phone now returned to her coat pocket, her face arranged back into something composed, and she sat down across from us and picked up right where she'd left off, asking some careful, rehearsed question about scheduling a follow-up conversation. And I understood, watching her mouth move through it, that every word she was saying now was theater, performed for an audience that had already made up its mind weeks earlier, in a document sitting sealed in a drawer about how the play was going to end. Watch night fell on a Tuesday that year, and by mid-morning, the whole island seemed to be moving toward the same low, steady hum of preparation, the particular energy that builds in a place ahead of the one night everybody agrees matters more than the rest. I spent the morning at Pray's house, setting up folding chairs in the fellowship hall, stringing the string of small white lights along the porch rail, the way I've done every December for 35 years, checking twice that the space heaters in the back corners were drawing proper current before the building filled with more bodies than it was built to hold comfortably. Deacon Ashby came by around noon with 2 of the younger men from the congregation, hauling in folding tables for the food that would come later, sweet potato pie, and rice, and gumbo, and whatever else the church mothers had spent the week cooking, and the whole building smelled by early afternoon like cinnamon and wood smoke and something warm underneath both. Children ran between the tables while their mothers worked, chasing each other around folding chairs that hadn't been set in their rows yet, and somebody's radio played gospel low from the kitchen the whole afternoon through. Reverend Gadsden passed through twice, checking on the sound system for that night's service, and each time he caught my eye, he gave me a small nod that said more than any full sentence could have. A nod that said the offer still stood whenever I was ready for it. I worked with my hands and let my mind stay mostly quiet the way I've trained it to over a lifetime of hanging drywall and running wire, though every so often setting a chair in its row or checking a light string for a dead bulb, I would catch myself thinking about that notarization date sitting in blue ink about a document finished and waiting in some drawer for 6 weeks before anybody thought to hand it to me, and my hands would go still on whatever they were doing until I made myself start moving them again. Odessa came by in the early evening to help set the tables, moving slower than she used to, but steady on her feet, wearing the gray coat she saves for occasions that matter. And once the last table was squared away, we sat together a while on the same bench outside the fellowship hall, where I'd once sat listening to 2 men through a wall, though I still had not told her that part. "You've been somewhere else all week," she said. "Not gone exactly, just somewhere else." "I know it. I told her." She studied my face a long moment in the fading light, the way she's studied it for 38 years, reading it the way other people read print. "Whatever you're carrying, Cornelius," she said, "I hope you know by now that you don't have to carry every piece of it alone. I've told you that more than once this year." "I know that too," I said. And it was true. And it was also true that some old habits sit deeper in a man than knowing alone can dig them out. "Your grandfather's silence," she said, gentle, not unkind. "It isn't a coat you have to keep wearing, Cornelius. You can take it off any time you decide to." I didn't have an answer ready for that one, so I didn't offer her a false one. I only reached over and took her hand, the way I've done 1,000 evenings on this same stretch of bench, and let that stand in for the words I couldn't quite locate yet. She let it rest there, the way she's learned to let some things rest until I'm ready to bring them to her myself, and we sat together, watching the sky over the marsh go from orange to a deep bruised purple, the first few stars showing faint above the tree line. And for a while, neither of us said anything else at all, which was its own kind of conversation. I walked her back to the truck once the cold really set in, and told her I'd be along after I'd finished a last check of the building. And she kissed my cheek and told me not to be too long, and drove off toward home to change before the service. I went back inside, alone. The fellowship hall sat quiet and ready in the early dark chairs in careful rows, the smell of supper still hanging warm in the air, candles set out along the windowsills, waiting to be lit once the congregation arrived. I walked the length of it once, checking what needed checking, straightening a chair here, a candle there, and then I found myself standing at the side entrance, the same door I'd stood outside of 20 years before, with my heart going hard in my chest for reasons that had nothing to do with tonight and everything to do with what tonight was about become. I reached out and put my hand flat against the old iron lock on that door, the same lock I've carried the key to for 35 years, cold under my palm in the December air. And I stood there a long moment, sensing something gathering in the dark outside that building, close now, closer than it had been that morning, the particular pressure in the air that comes before a storm finally decides to break. Something was coming. I did not yet know its shape. I only knew, standing there with my hand on that cold iron, that I was not going to like it, and that whatever it turned out to be, I would not be able to say afterward that it had come without any warning at all. By 9 o'clock that night, Praise House had filled past what its walls were built to hold. Every folding chair taken, people standing 3 deep along the back wall and spilling out into the fellowship hall behind it. Candlelight moving warm and gold across faces I'd known my whole life, and a few younger ones I was still learning the names of. The choir had finished its second hymn of the evening, and the room had settled into that particular quiet that comes over a congregation once the singing gives way to reflection. The quiet where people start turning inward, taking stock of the year closing out around them. Reverend Gadsden stood at the front, his voice low and steady, inviting anyone moved to share a word of testimony before the watch continued toward midnight. And one after another, members of the congregation rose in their places, speaking of a year's hardships, survived a grandchild born, a debt finally cleared. The particular accounting a community does together once a year out loud in the same room. Miss Pearl stood and thanked the church for its prayers during her sister's surgery. A young man I recognize from the choir spoke about finishing his first year of college, the first in his family to go. His mother crying 2 rows back before he'd even finished his second sentence. I sat near the back, with Odessa's hand resting light in mine, and for a while, listening to those voices rise and settle around me, I let myself believe the night might simply pass the way every other watch night of my life had passed, quiet and full and ordinary in its sacredness. Then Renata stood up. She was seated 3 rows ahead of us near the aisle, and she rose slowly, deliberately, in a way that made the whole room's attention shift toward her, before she'd said a single word. The particular gravity a standing figure pulls in a room full of seated ones. Beside her, Desmond went very still, his hand half raised toward her sleeve, as though to stop her, then dropping back to his knee as though he'd decided against it. Or perhaps had known this was coming all along, and simply hadn't found the nerve to say so. "I want to say something," she said, her voice carrying clean through that hushed room. "And I want my father to hear it, since he hasn't given me the chance anywhere else." A murmur moved through the pews, soft, uncertain, the sound of a congregation recalibrating in real time. Renata Odessa said quiet, but carrying, "Not now." "I don't think there's ever going to be a good time," Renata said, and something in her voice had gone thin and strained, close to breaking, though whether from anger or from something closer to grief, I could not tell from where I sat. "That's exactly the problem. This land," she said, "this church, our family's property, it's time we talked honestly about its future, about what makes sense going forward. I don't think that's a betrayal of anything. I think it's what responsible people do." Every face in that building turned toward me at once, slow, like a tide changing direction, the whole weight of that turning settling onto my chest with a pressure I had not braced myself for. Not here. Not on this particular night, not in front of the one room on this island where I had spent 35 years being nobody in particular, simply the man who kept the keys. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I sat very still in my pew, with Odessa's hand tightening hard around mine, and past Renata's shoulder through the tall window at the side of the fellowship hall. Headlights swept slow across the glass, and then held steady, an engine idling low and mechanical, just beyond the church gate, yellow and enormous against the December dark. Waiting. Nobody in that room needed it explained to them what that machine was, or why it had chosen tonight of all nights to sit there with its engine running. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever sat inside of in that building. Not the reverent quiet of a prayer, not the settled hush before a hymn, but something else entirely. 300 people holding their breath together, waiting to see what the man who had swept these floors for 35 years was going to do with the thing that had just been done to him in front of all of them. Somewhere near the front, a candle guttered and steadied itself. A child, too young to understand the shape of the silence, asked her mother in a whisper why everybody had stopped talking. And her mother hushed her gentle without taking her eyes off me. I reached into my coat pocket slowly, unhurried, and took out my phone. I did not look at Renata. I did not look at the machine idling beyond the gate, its headlights cutting twin lines through the dark toward the window glass. I looked down at the small lit screen in my hand, found the name I needed, and pressed it, and lifted the phone to my ear, the same way I have answered every call that has ever mattered in my life. Steady, unhurried, a man who has learned that the loudest response to a threat is very often no response at all, only the quiet certainty of a decision already made. It rang twice before Julian picked up, his voice low with surprise at hearing from me at this hour, on this night of all nights.
and I said only what needed saying, calm as I could manage it. "Julian, it's Cornelius. They've brought the equipment. It's sitting outside the church right now, engine running, in front of the whole congregation. Somewhere out past that gate, the machine kept idling in the cold, patient, indifferent, waiting on a decision that had already, in every way that mattered, been made for it, though not one soul standing outside that door yet understood that it had." A week after watch night, a certified letter arrived at the house, and I signed for it standing on my own front porch in the cold January morning. My hands steady enough by then that I no longer needed to brace them against anything to keep the paper from shaking. Renata had filed a partition action in probate court listing herself as a co-tenant of the property by virtue of her position as our sole heir under the state's heirs property statutes, and asking the court to order the land sold and the proceeds divided on the grounds that continued joint ownership had become, in the language of the filing, impractical and no longer in the best interests of any party involved. Julian did not seem surprised when I called him with the news. "This is what I meant," he said about paperwork rarely traveling alone. The hearing was set for the second week of February in the Beaufort County Courthouse, a low brick building with a flag hanging still in windless cold outside its doors. Julian met me on the steps that morning in a dark suit I hadn't seen him wear before, and Odessa walked in beside me in her gray coat, her hand steady in the crook of my arm, and I understood, walking through those doors together, that whatever this room decided in the next few hours, we were going to hear it standing exactly where we'd stood through everything else this year, side by side. Renata sat across the room with an attorney I didn't recognize. A sharp young man from a Charleston firm who spoke with the particular fluency of someone paid handsomely to sound certain about things. Desmond sat behind them both, and Renata did not look my way once through the whole first half hour, her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the way a person looks when they've decided that looking directly at something will cost more than they're prepared to pay that morning. The attorney argued well, I'll grant him that. He spoke of my age, of Odessa's health, of the burden of maintaining property this size on a fixed income, of the reasonable and responsible path a sale would offer towards securing our care for whatever years remained to us. He used the word burden 4 times in 10 minutes. He made continuing to live in my own home sound like a kindness I was too stubborn to accept from my own daughter. I watched the judge's face as he spoke, and for a stretch of minutes there, I confess I did not like what I saw settling into her expression, something that looked uncomfortably close to persuasion. Beside me, Odessa's grip on my hand tightened with every sentence, and I understood she was hearing the same thing I was hearing. A courtroom slowly being talked into believing that losing everything might be the responsible choice. Then Julian stood. He did not raise his voice either, and I understood watching him rise that he had learned that particular lesson somewhere along the way too. Perhaps from a kitchen table 20 years back, perhaps simply from growing up watching people who never once needed volume to be believed. "Your Honor," he said, "South Carolina's Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act exists precisely to prevent what's being requested here today, a forced sale of generational land before every co-tenant has been offered a genuine opportunity to buy out the interest in question. My client has never been offered that opportunity. He learned of this filing by certified mail the same way any stranger would have learned of it. He entered the red ledger into evidence next every dated page, every conversation recorded in my own hand across the better part of a year, and then he laid the notarized trust document beside it, open to the final page, and asked the court to note the discrepancy between the notarization date and the date the petitioner had represented in this same courthouse's own filed record 6 weeks prior as the date the document was first drafted. The room went very quiet. Renata's attorney rose halfway out of his chair, then sat back down without finishing whatever objection he'd started to shape his certainty from 20 minutes earlier, nowhere in evidence now. The judge studied that page a long while, her reading glasses low on her nose, flipping back once to compare it against something in the filing itself, and when she finally looked up, she looked past both attorneys and directly at Renata. "Miss Pryor," she said, "I'd like you to explain to me why a document represented to your father as freshly prepared carries a notary's date 6 weeks earlier than that representation." Renata did not have an answer ready.
I watched her open her mouth and close it again, and for the first time since she'd stood up in that fellowship hall, I saw something in her face that looked less like resolve and more like a woman watching her own careful architecture come apart in front of a stranger with the authority to say so out loud. The judge set her glasses down on the bench. "Petition denied," she said. "This court finds insufficient good faith basis for partition by sale, and directs the petitioner to pursue, if she chooses to pursue anything further at all, the statutory buyout process this state has established for exactly this purpose." Julian's hand found my shoulder before I'd even fully understood what I'd just heard, and I sat there in that hard wooden chair with Odessa's fingers gripping mine, hard enough to ache both of us silent, neither one of us quite ready yet to trust that it was over. Somewhere behind me, I heard my daughter's chair scrape back against the floor as she rose to leave the room, without once looking in my direction. Her footsteps quick and uneven against the tile, gone before I could decide whether I wanted to call after her or simply let her go. I found her in the courthouse hallway, not far past the door, standing with one hand braced against the cool marble wall, like she needed it to keep herself upright. Her composure entirely gone now, mascara tracked dark down both cheeks, her shoulders moving with breaths that weren't quite steady. Down the corridor, a janitor pushed a cart past without looking our way, the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon continuing on around us as though nothing in that building had just changed the shape of anybody's life. "Dad," she said when she saw me coming, her voice cracking clean in half on that single word. I stopped a few feet from her. Odessa and Julian had held back near the courtroom doors, giving us whatever room this needed, and I stood there in that echoing hallway with my own daughter falling apart in front of me for the first time since she was a girl small enough to still let me see it happen without trying to hide it from me first. "I don't know how we got here," she said. "I keep trying to find the exact moment it all went wrong, and I can't find it." There isn't one moment. It's just years of moments stacked up so slow I never noticed the pile getting tall enough to stand on. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you today," I said, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect it to. Come out steadier by a considerable margin than whatever was moving underneath it. "I'm not there yet, Renata, and I won't lie to you and say I am. Not even now, not even with you standing here like this." She nodded quick like she'd expected exactly that answer and was bracing to receive it anyway. "But I'm also not going to spend whatever years I've got left being angry at you either," I went on. "I've done enough of that this past year to know it isn't a place I want to live in permanent." "You could have just talked to us," she said, her voice small now, almost young. "Instead of all this, the lawyer, the trust, the courtroom." "I could say the same about you," I told her, not unkindly. "Talking has never come easy to either one of us, has it? We're more alike than you've ever wanted to admit, Renata. That's part of what made this whole year so hard to watch happen." "What does that mean?" she asked, her eyes coming up to mine for the first time since we'd stood there, red-rimmed and searching the lawyer in her momentarily entirely absent. Only the girl I raised left standing in that hallway, asking me a plain question. "It means the door isn't locked," I told her. "It's not open wide either, not yet, but it isn't locked. Your mother still asks about you every single week, Renata. Every week, whether you've called or not. That part isn't mine to fix, it never was. But it's yours anytime you're ready to walk through it and mean it." Her chin trembled once hard, and she pressed both hands flat over her face for a moment, her whole body drawing inward around whatever was moving through her. And I wanted, standing there, more than I have wanted almost anything in my life, to close the distance between us and hold my daughter the way I used to hold her when she was small enough to fit against one shoulder, back when a scraped knee was the largest wound either of us knew how to carry between us. I did not move toward her. Some old caution in me, worn deep as a groove in a well-used stair, kept my feet planted exactly where they were. The same caution that had kept me quiet in a hallway 20 years earlier. The same caution my own mother wore like a second skin her whole life, without ever once setting it down. I have turned that moment over more times since than I care to admit, wondering whether it was wisdom holding me back, or simply the same tired habit that has cost me more in this life than it has ever once protected.
She pulled herself back together the way she has always known how to do, quick practiced a woman rebuilding her own composure, brick by brick, in front of an audience she still cared enough to perform for, even now, even here, even with nobody left in that hallway who needed the performance to believe her.
"I need some time," she said. "Take it," I told her. She nodded once more and turned and walked back down that long marble hallway toward the doors where Desmond stood waiting, not moving to meet her halfway, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable at that distance. I watched her go the whole distance without calling after her, though something in my chest pulled hard in that direction the entire time, insisting, the way it had insisted all year, that this was not the end of anything, only the closing of one particular chapter, in a much longer argument neither one of us had finished having yet, and I turned back toward Odessa and Julian waiting by the courtroom doors, my legs steadier than I expected them to be for a man who had just watched his daughter walk away from him twice in one afternoon. A month after the courthouse, on a mild Saturday morning in March, the South Carolina Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor Commission held its spring gathering on the grounds outside Praise House folding chairs, set in rows across grass just beginning to green after winter, a small wooden podium set up beneath the same live oaks that had shaded that building for longer than anyone present could account for. Reverend Gadsden had asked me weeks before, gently, whether I was ready now, and I had told him yes before I had fully finished deciding it for myself, the way a man sometimes commits to a thing out loud before his heart has entirely caught up with his mouth. Odessa sat in the front row, in her gray coat, her hand resting on my knee, and she did not yet know exactly what was coming, only that Gadsden had asked us both to be there, and that something in my manner over the past week had told her this was not an ordinary Saturday. Julian sat 2 rows back, in a blazer instead of a suit for once, and beside him sat a woman I didn't recognize, his wife perhaps, though I hadn't yet had the occasion to ask. The commission's director spoke first, a woman named Dr. Alberta Ford, who had spent 30 years documenting land loss across the Lowcountry, and she told the story plainly, the way I imagined she had told similar stories many times before, at gatherings much like this one, in counties up and down this coast. 20 years ago, she said, a scheme to falsify boundary records threatened to strip more than 40 acres of heirs' property from families right here on this island. Families who had held that land since Reconstruction without ever once needing a courthouse to tell them it was theirs. That scheme was uncovered and stopped because one man spent 2 weeks documenting what he witnessed at considerable personal risk and brought that evidence to the families and authorities who needed it most, and then never once in 20 years sought any recognition for having done it. She looked out at the folding chairs, then at the gathered congregation and the handful of state officials who'd made the drive down for the occasion, and she said my name. Odessa's hand went still on my knee. 300 faces turned toward me the second time in 4 months that a room full of people had done exactly that. Though this turning carried none of the cold weight the one at watch night had carried, this one, warmer, rounder, closer to the particular pressure of being held than the pressure of being accused. A woman I did not recognize stood up from somewhere in the middle rows, mid-40s, a stranger to me entirely. "My name is Rachel Adams," she said, her voice carrying steady across the grass. "My grandmother was Adele Ravenel. I grew up hearing about a man who never gave his name, who sat at our kitchen table one night and changed the whole direction of my family's life. I did not know until 3 weeks ago that man was you, Mr. Odom. I wanted to be here today to say thank you in person. Finally, after 20 years of not knowing who to thank." I could not speak. I sat there with my hands flat on my knees, my back straight, the way my own mother taught me to sit when something important was being decided. And I nodded, because it was the only thing I trusted myself to do, without my voice breaking clean in half in front of that whole gathering. Rachel Adams held my gaze a long moment longer before she sat back down, and something in her face told me she understood exactly how much that nod had cost me, and was grateful for it anyway.
Dr. Ford announced before the applause had even fully settled that the commission would be dedicating a permanent historical marker at the edge of the Praise House grounds, honoring the preservation of heirs' property on this island, my name included in the language of the plaque itself. The applause rose up around me, unhurried at first, then gathering the way water gathers before it finds its way downhill, until the whole gathering was on its feet, the sound of it lifting up into the oak branches overhead and holding there a long moment before it finally let go, and somewhere in that standing crowd, I caught Reverend Gadsden's eye, and he gave me the same small nod he'd given me weeks before at watch night. Though this time it needed no further explanation at all. I turned once the crowd had settled back into their seats to look at Odessa beside me. She was not crying, not exactly, though her eyes were bright in a way I recognized from other hard, full moments across 38 years of marriage. She was looking at me with an expression I did not have a name for immediately. Something that held both pride and a particular kind of ache at once. The specific ache of a woman realizing in real time, in front of 300 witnesses, just how much of her own husband's life she had been living beside, without ever once being allowed all the way inside it. I did not hold her gaze. I looked instead at my own hands, at the oak leaves scattered across the grass at my feet, at anything at all that was not my wife's face in that particular moment, because I understood, without either of us saying a single word about it, that what I would find there was more than I currently had the courage to receive. Beside me, her hand found mine anyway, whether I was looking or not, and held on, patient, the way she has held on through every hard season of 38 years waiting, as she has always been willing to wait for me to be ready to look. My phone rang on a Tuesday evening in April, while I was out back checking on Odessa's tomatoes staked deep the way I'd promised her they'd hold, and I saw Renata's name on the screen and let it ring twice before I answered, not to make a point, only because I needed those 2 rings to decide what kind of conversation I was willing to have.
"Dad," she said when I picked up, "can we meet? Just us, no Jason, no Desmond, no lawyers. I'll come to you or wherever's easiest."
We met the next afternoon at a small place off Route 21, a diner with vinyl booths and pie kept under glass by the register, a place neither one of us had any history with, no memory attached to a single wall of it, which I understood, sitting down across from her, might have been exactly why she'd chosen it. She was already there when I arrived, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, and something in her face carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent several days losing an argument with herself. She apologized before I'd even finished sliding into the booth. Real words in the right order about Port Royal, about the document sitting notarized in a drawer for 6 weeks while she let me believe it was fresh, about every visit that had turned somewhere along the way into something closer to an appraisal than a conversation. I listened. I watched her hands loosen slowly around that mug as she talked, the way hands loosen when a person is finally setting something down, instead of only describing the weight of carrying it. "The firm was 3 weeks from losing its line of credit when I filed that petition," she said. "I told myself I was still doing right by you and Mom underneath it all, that the timing was just timing, coincidence, nothing more. I don't believe that anymore. I haven't believed it in a while, if I'm honest with myself, which I clearly haven't been very good at lately." A waitress refilled my coffee without either of us acknowledging her, and somewhere behind the counter a radio played something low and instrumental. The particular kind of song a diner plays when it wants conversation to happen without competing against it. I let Renata finish everything she'd come to say. I have gotten better this past year at letting people finish, at not rushing in to fill a silence just because silence has always made me uncomfortable in ways I am still learning to sit with. I still think she said then some kind of formal arrangement makes sense. Not what I asked for before, nothing about where you live, but maybe a financial advisor we both trust, someone to help with planning so nothing catches any of us off guard again. I set my coffee down and took a moment before I answered the way I take a moment before I speak on anything that matters. Letting the words settle into their right order before I let them out into the room. "Renata," I said, "stop. I need you to hear me clearly on this."
She went still across the table, bracing the way she'd braced in that courthouse hallway. "I am never going to sign something like that again," I told her. "Not because I don't trust you, because I have read closely in plain language exactly what documents like that can do, and I am not willing to hand my life or your mother's life over to anyone on paper, not even you. Not even with the best intentions in the world sitting behind it." Her eyes filled, and her chin trembled once hard, and she pressed her lips together and looked out at the parking lot traffic on Route 21 for a long moment before she looked back at me. "I don't know how we got here," she said again, the same words from the courthouse hallway, though her voice carried something steadier underneath them this time. Less panic, more plain grief. "I do," I told her gently as I could manage it. "But that's a longer conversation than we have time for tonight over pie and coffee neither one of us has touched." She almost laughed at that, a small, surprised sound, and it was the first thing close to her old laugh I'd heard from her in the better part of a year. The laugh I remembered from before she was old enough to be embarrassed by anything about me at all. We sat a while longer, talking about smaller things, safer things, her work, the weather, whether Odessa's garden would survive the late frost the forecast kept threatening. And when we finally stood to leave, she hugged me at the door, briefer than the hugs from before all this started, but real, both her arms coming all the way around instead of just one shoulder offered out of duty. I stood in that gravel lot a while after her taillights had swung out onto Route 21 and disappeared, the evening going gray and soft around me, the diner's neon sign flickering on somewhere behind me against the coming dark. And I did not know, standing there, whether what had just happened between us amounted to a beginning or only a slightly gentler kind of ending. The door was open. I had told her so myself, more than once now. But a door standing open is not the same thing as somebody walking through it, and I drove home that evening with a particular weight sitting behind my ribs that had no easy name to it. The kind I suspect I will be carrying in some form or another for whatever years I have left to carry it, and the kind I was, for the first time in a long while, no longer entirely afraid of naming. Watch night came around again, the way it always does, and this time, when I climbed the steps of Praise House Odessa's, arm was looped through mine, steady, and a second key cut fresh that autumn passed from my palm into Julian Ravenel's before the first candle was even lit. Nobody in that room needed the story explained to them anymore. I had seen to that myself, every part of it, including the parts I had once decided were mine alone to carry. For most of my life, I believed that keeping the people I loved safe meant keeping quiet. That a man protects what matters most by carrying its weight alone and never once setting it down where anyone else might see how heavy it had gotten. I have since learned something slower to arrive at and harder to hold on to. A door kept locked against every risk keeps out the harm, yes, but it keeps out the help too. And a man can spend 40 years so busy guarding the threshold that he forgets to notice who has been standing outside it the whole time, waiting only to be let in. What stays with me isn't the courtroom or the ledger or the marker with my name cut into it out past the gate. It's the relief of finally being known fully by the people God put in my path to know me. I believe God places certain trials in a life not to break a man, but to show him what he was carrying that he never had to carry alone. And I believe God was patient with me the whole while I was learning that, slow and proud as I was about it. If you were me sitting at that kitchen table with a lifetime of silence stacked up around you, would you have opened that door sooner? Or would you have kept it locked the way I did for far too many years? Tell me in the comments what your own door looks like and who's still standing outside it. If this story found something true in you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And if you believe quiet people deserve to be heard, stay with this channel. We'll be right here.